Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 108, Evaluation, Design versus Digitizing versus Execution. Good afternoon, folks, and welcome into the Takeup. Happy Friday, and happy to see you here. For those who celebrate Good Friday, happy Good Friday to you guys. Happy Easter, happy Passover, whatever holiday it is for you and yours. I'm happy to have you here and celebrating Education Friday, at least with me, as well as whatever else you're celebrating and doing. I hope you have a good weekend as it comes up. But today we're going to talk about things that are near and dear to our hearts. If you are here and among the reciprocators, I'm sure that is embroidery. And in this case, talking about the difference between embroidery design, embroidery digitizing, and embroidery execution, and what that can mean to our designs. Part of the way I kind of sold this episode is to talk about the way we evaluate when things go wrong, why things look the way they do, why things work the way they do, and how we react to them. So, for those of you who are here, I know holiday weekend may not be everybody here who's usually here, but I'm happy to have you here and along for the ride. And if you're listening later on, if you are part of the hashtag replay squad, then know that you can ask any questions you like and certainly jump in and get involved with the conversation here in the comments. Suffice it to say, this is something we have covered before. It is something we will cover again, but there are some new spins to it. I have talked about diagnosing designs and written and taught various classes on diagnosing designs, diagnosing embroidery issues that you may be having. What I'm hoping, however, is that we can talk a little bit more about not just that process of diagnosis, that process of figuring out what's going on with your embroidery, the process and the holistic nature, let's say, of all these different processes and how they come together and what it does to make the embroidery design turn out the way it is, but also discuss a little bit about our assumptions, because part of the thing that brought me to talking about this particular topic this week is I've had some questions from people that were quite pointed on this event. Essentially, that they were dealing with online groups when they're talking about their embroidery. They're coming in trying to figure out what's going on with the design. They're troubleshooting. They're saying the questions that I put in the original channel cap for this one, in the original description for this. What is going on here? What is wrong with this piece? And if you've been a lurker in any of these embroidery groups, whatever home embroidery groups, commercial embroidery groups, it really does not matter. If you have been in the embroidery world looking at what's going on, then what I'm going to say for sure, you have probably had this same issue where everybody is discussing kind of this litany of different choices of why things might be going wrong, of why things might not be turning out right, and they are flatly contradicting each other. They're just throwing things at the wall. Everybody has a different attitude. And here's the actual truth of this thing. Though I'm going to talk about the different things that can go wrong and the kind of synergy, if you want to use a buzzword for it, between all the different things that we do to make the process right, there are often multiple ways to go about fixing a problem, and we may not be dealing with the source of the problem. We might be dealing with kind of the symptoms of the problem. And frequently that can be the case where we're having something like a registration issue, registration being where, say, an outline doesn't line up with a fill, and immediately people are going to jump to the different reasons they think it's there. And the thing is, it could be any number of things. You can have any part, the digitizing, the design, the execution. Design not as much, but it can be involved. But like the digitizing and any part of the embroidery execution can feed into this. The thing is, you can correct with more than one way of coming about it, and it might not necessarily be the best way, the most the easiest way to get things done, or anything of that nature. You can find yourself trying to attack the symptom, which is the outline not lining up with the fill, but you're using multiple ways. So frequently, what are we going to see? We're going to see people jumping in saying, all right, it's the stabilizer, you're not stabilized. It's the hoop, you're not hooping correctly. It's the fabric, don't do it this way. Float instead of hoop. Baste it down with stitches. Use adhesives to make it stay stable. The digitizer should have adjusted for the pull or the push compensation or the shape. You're running it too fast, you're running it too slow, you're running it out of sequence. Everyone has an opinion to how this goes on, but we're usually reacting to one photograph of it, of something that's wrong, often of a piece that is currently unhooped. It's no longer on the machine. We're not watching it run, and we don't have the file in front of us. And often that really means that we're taking kind of shots in the dark. The thing is, we're working on our own piece. We're lucky enough to have all the information. We know how this happened because we have watched the design, hopefully. I'm going to talk about steps that we can take to diagnose our own designs that will help us get there. But suffice it to say, the truth of the matter is, if you're in any one of these online groups to talk about embroidery, you have seen this whole explosion of reasons for why something doesn't turn out the way that they think it should, for why something isn't running the way that they hope it would. And that like I said, the cacophony of people jumping in and telling you what's wrong with your stuff, realize that your sample may not be wrong for any of the reasons somebody put together or multiple reasons that somebody put together, but that we can talk about the different ways these different elements come together to make embroidery run the way it does. And perhaps we'll arrive at our own way of sampling, our own way of looking at the problem, and our own way of understanding the kind of collective of what this all is, of the design, of the digitizing, of the execution. And when I say execution, that is not only just embroidery, but the kind of materials we use and the way that we utilize them and how that comes together, not only to make the design work, but I'm going to talk a little about assumptions. The other part of this discussion that is not part of the original stuff I've written about in diagnosing designs is that the longer I've worked in software, the longer I've worked in teaching digitizing, there is a ton of stuff that is based out of assumptions people have about software, about digitizing truths, about settings in software, and about what these things mean. And frankly, sometimes in online communities, we can get into comment threads where uh, the the buzzwords fly back and forth, but the actual nature of what's going on isn't being discussed. It's more about people telling you what to change, what numbers to change, what dials to tweak, if at all, or there's people who are just saying all these things but don't tell you at all why that might be or what the results are or what you should be looking for to make that happen. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We'll jump into some things. I've got some slides probably from one of my earlier presentations or a couple of those that we might take a look at, but we're just going to kind of go over this. It might be a shorter episode today, but this is something I wanted to discuss because I've had multiple people asking me in the last week, what is the thing that made everything run incorrectly for me? I've got these outlines that aren't working. I've got these patches that aren't running well. I've got this material that's wrinkling up. And frankly, there's usually multiple things that could be going on. And it's about understanding how all these things come together and frankly, looking at our assumptions about how software works, our assumptions about how artwork rather should be laid out, and how that comes together to make our final result. What are the things we can do to work on that? And maybe a little bit about the process that we go through in our digitizing and preparations that will help us to not achieve or to achieve the right results, or at least when we don't achieve the results we want to, it'll help us to isolate where the problem is. Let's go ahead and say hi to some folks. You guys know I like to talk to people who are here in the live, so I'll discuss that a little bit, some stuff that people are saying in the chat. And like I said previously, if you are live, please ask questions in the chat, derail the session. This is a session that's really about kind of reacting to what's going on in the online space anyway. So why not? Let's talk about your experiences. Tell me, when did this happen to you that people were giving you tons of partially solicited, maybe somewhat unsolicited advice that did or didn't lead you to understand something better? Talk about your experiences about diagnosing designs and let me know what you think. And if you are coming back, like I said, on the replay squad, please still ask questions. Tell us what you want to see in the next episode and be part of the reciprocator crowd. All right. So I'm going to say hello to Bevy Jean, who is here. And she says, have a happy Easter, everybody. I agree. Hope you guys all have a happy Easter. Barb says, hi, Eric. Hi, everyone. Hi, Barb. Happy to have you in. Brian Bailey, Creative and Brilliance, is around and here. Good afternoon, Brian. Boy, don't you know about people having assumptions about how things work versus how they really work. Marissa says, hello, happy Good Friday. First time here. Happy to have you in, Marissa. This is maybe not the most digitizing heavy episode, at least not the how-to episode, but go check out over 100 episodes of content that may suit you. But if you have a question, please jump in and ask. Frank Dunn from out in the UK. Frank, good evening, and thank you for sharing and being an awesome part of the community as always. Ramona, digitizing herself, says here, hi, Ramona. We got some people talking to each other as well, which is great. Love when you guys are interacting in the comments. And also, Ramona says, what am I doing wrong? Oh, man, is that always the hardest thing to answer for folks? What am I doing wrong? What are the problems people are having? It is frequently hard to isolate, but we're going to talk about how we get there and also understanding that sometimes things aren't necessarily right or wrong, but provide a result. Let's put it this way. What can we do to get the result we want? Right and wrong answers. There are maybe some right and wrong answers, especially when we're talking about assumptions we make about how things work. But in the end, what we're really looking for is how can we get the results that we want out of things? That's really what we're on about. So we have that going on. Justin digitizing himself again today. I know we talked about the difficulties of digitizing difficult art earlier. Justin says, hello, all. Hello, Justin. Chuck says, good afternoon, Eric. And good afternoon, Chuck. Happy to have you in. And Kudzai says, uh, happy Easter, everyone watching from Zambia. Thank you for tuning in. I love to have people from all over the world tuning in, and hopefully there's something helpful here for you too. So let's talk about it, folks. What are we talking about? We're seeing these these responses, these people talking about what's going on with their embroidery and trying to figure out what's wrong. What are the issues that they're having, right? Uh, there are multiple things we can get into with that. Obviously, it's it's not one thing, and it's almost never one thing that's wrong. There's usually multiple things that could be either wrong or at least not contributing the way we would like them to make our embroidery the way they need to look. But this was the thing that I posited, right? And I put verses in between all of these because it looks like it's a contest or a challenge or things that are fighting with each other, and sometimes they are. Design versus digitizing versus execution. Now, let me just define quickly what I mean by these things. When I'm talking about design here, I'm not talking about our embroidery design as in the file that we're using. When I'm talking about design here, I'm talking about the suitability of the design we're working from, the art we're working from for embroidery. Because this is another one of those assumptions. One of the problems we have with assumptions is that people assume that anything they can do in print, anything that they can do in another medium, whether that's screen print or sublimation or any other sort of decoration they might entail, they think they can do it in embroidery, especially people who are new to embroidery. They don't necessarily know the limitations of the medium, or at least that there are some limitations or alterations we make to art to make things work. The other issue can also be that we're following a design very slavishly when we don't need to make it the best embroidery can be. If you haven't heard me say this before, especially as a commercial digitizer, it can be very difficult. People bring in art that they want to see represented. However, our jobs as embroiderers, our best job, especially commercial embroiderers, is to make the best embroidered result inspired by interpreting the art that's provided for us. That's our job. The best embroidered result. Our result, honestly, I think our job is not the most fidelity to the original art brought in. Fidelity to the original art is part of the judgment as to whether our art is working for the customer. But the best embroidered result means the best result, the best look, the highest quality result that we can achieve in embroidery. That, and here's the other caveat. If you didn't watch last week's episode, we talked about what makes a design good for people and what the goals are in communicating with your customer. That, the best embroidered result, that provides the needs of the customer, that answers their question. If it's self promotion, if it's professional look, if it's cool shirt, if it's employee culture, whatever that is, whatever their goal is, we want to provide as embroiderers the best embroidered result that fulfills their goals. And sometimes that means we stretch the fidelity to the original art. We stretch how closely we're matching the original art. And I know that that's something I harp on over and over and over again, but I think I need to harp on that. We are not just here to reproduce the art that's in front of us, the original design that's in front of us, slavishly with no alterations. We're here to employ our knowledge of the medium of embroidery to make the best embroidered result that we can achieve that fulfills the customer's needs. Sometimes hits the customer's budget too. It might be a question we have to answer. And we do that with the knowledge that we are going to make some alterations. So the design can be part of this. Now, we as embroiderers and digitizers, we may not always be doing that design work ourselves or altering the designs ourselves. We may have someone else we have to answer to. We may have a design professional. We may be discussing it with someone who's done logo work for the people before that we're dealing with for doing business to business. If this is for ourselves or for our creative work, we have a little more. I think it's a little more lenient because we can do this work understanding that we're making a creative object that we should be the captains of. And here's the other thing too. I'll say I've seen lots of people doing craft or creative work who are being slavish to the artwork in front of them when they're doing it for their own pleasure. And I'm like, hey, this is your chance. You are the person, you are the arbiter of whether this turns out correctly or not. Make some considerations for your embroidery in your art phase. If there are lines that are too thin or too close together, remove some. If there are details that won't work in the kind of stitch you want to use, alter them. If the text is not going to work at the size that it is spec'd out for, change it, alter it, move it, change the font, and find something that works better for you. Change the typeface. These are things that we can do and should do to make the best embroidered result. Now, that's part of it. So why do I put design in this space? Is that sometimes people come in either because they're new to embroidery or because they have not dealt with the customer's expectations, or at least they're reticent somehow or having an issue dealing with customer expectations and letting them know that some things are not going to be done at a certain size with a certain stitch type in embroidery. So design is part of this. Sometimes the whole problem I'm seeing with people, they're frustrated. text isn't coming out right. It doesn't look good. It doesn't work here. And often it's also a combination of materials. We know that material interactions can happen. We're going to talk about that and maybe see some images of that later, where interactions between different stitch types and textured materials or materials that have a grain to them can cause roughness in the edges, stuff like that. Uh, some of it is really that the design has not been altered for embroidery, that they are trying too hard to have ultimate fidelity to the design, or that they sometimes you have an unreasonable customer who just thinks embroidery can do things that it cannot do and does not, and they are not willing to listen to you, and it doesn't compute for them when you try and describe the differences between embroidery and print and what it is. I mean, certainly I like to tell them, hey, I'm shoving a needle tens of thousands of times through a piece of fabric with thread attached to it. The fidelity of that compared to tiny, tiny dots of ink being deposited, by a print head, it's a very different thing. Thousands of stab holes in your design where I jam some thread through and leave it behind. It's a very different kind of fidelity we can achieve in embroidery. Can we get a lot of clarity? Yes, we can. Can we get ultimate clarity at teeny tiny sizes? Not always. But hey, remember to ask that question. How is this going to be viewed? Who's supposed to see it? And can they read it from the distance they're going to see it? Remember, handshake distance, folks. Not all small text, not all small details will be seen on embroidery. Ask what's important from the customer. However, some of it is just the design, where no matter what I do, certain kinds of designs. One of the ones that always befuddled me, tiny state seals inside of badges. So here we have our left chest badge, and inside of the left chest badge is a little tiny seal the size of a dime. There will be a limit to how much detail I can put inside of that state seal that was originally conceived as some large piece and was done as stamped metal or printing or painting or something else. There is a limit to how much detail we can pack into a small area, but we also have to realize that with the use of the object and the fact that we'll usually be 3 to 4 feet away from anybody wearing a garment with something on it, which is our primary place that we're showing most of our embroidery, especially in the commercial world, the chances of them seeing or being able to read that stuff from that detail is, or from that distance, is also pretty low. So the balance should be in that. Sometimes we have to alter the design, and some of the stuff that I see, everybody's jumping on and saying, it's the digitizing, it's the fabric, it's this, it's that, use thinner thread, use whatever. When frankly, sometimes the designs that are in front of us are not well suited to the medium of embroidery, and no one has talked to the customer or has felt comfortable enough to talk to the customer about the possibility of change, or that what they're asking for might not even be in their best interest. So before I go any further with anything else, with talking about digitizing, talking about analyzing materials, talking about stabilizers, any of that stuff, I want to make it clear that design is a portion of this and sometimes requires us to deal with graphic designers, to deal with customers, to redesign work, to lay it out differently. And I think that's something that's fairly fair. We have to discuss what's best for the medium. We have to talk to our customers about their expectations, and I think that's just fair. And by the way, I love this. Daryl says, yes, glad you, glad you agree, Daryl. Daryl produces some really excellent screen printing embroidery, so love to see that stuff. He's got really cool packages for his clients. Love what he's doing. Jorita has made it. Happy to be back. Happy to have you in, Jorita, and happy to see Marta here as well from Texas. Happy to have all you guys in. It's like having all my old friends around at the table. Anyway, so let's just show you something on the stream. This is something I've shown you before, but hey, it's one of the examples that I show in my classes, and I think it's fair to say, right? Let's take the banner off and just actually get into this. So this is a customer request, and I'm going to just kind of show you what I meant, right? In essence, we have this left chest design that they want at 4 inches wide or less. It's going to go on light colored piqué polo shirts. What do we know about this, right? We talk about this all the time, right? Materials matter. The material we run on is going to matter. Why? Because we're jamming a needle several thousand times with threads through it into a textured, stretchy garment. The way the material behaves will change the way it looks. Super fine dress shirt, poplin, twill, something like that is going to hold detail in a way that a textured cotton piqué polo will not. Detail and the way that stitches interact with material can make a difference, even if we use toppings, even if we use other support materials, and that's also part of the materials matter banner. So this is what the customer comes in with. Left chest, 4 inches wide or less. Light color piqué polo shirts, we have to have all this text. That's the first thing they say, right? Cool. Not necessarily a problem, but we're already looking at this and saying, if I shrink this thing to 4 inches in width, then very obviously this general contractor text on the bottom is not going to run at that size. That is not going to be the way this turns out. If we analyze it, we're going to say, all right, all these little shadow pieces, everything that's in here, and let me go ahead and grab my pointer focus. You can see me while I'm pointing at things. Uh, if we can do that, that makes it a little bit easier. You can see my pointer. If we look at all these little shadow lines that are in here around the top of this, see all the shadows and multiple colors around this, especially we're in in these tiny little spaces, especially at size. The shadows are not going to run really reliably. If this art, they say we can't change anything and they complain about these shadows, we probably are going to have to, well, I'll say this for certain. We're going to have to change some of it because we know we're not going to get a satin stitch that's much under 1 millimeter to reveal reliably at the edge of these things. And they're going to be way under that. And honestly, if we try and do straight stitch outlines in orange around this blue, the straight stitch outlines are likely to look a little bit broken and probably not the best. They're certainly not going to look like what we have here. We're going to have to make alterations if we keep them. And honestly, when I'm looking at this at 4 inches, I'm just going to say they're not going to run reliably. I want them gone. Also, the text, way smaller than any sort of safe text sizes. We can talk about that again. It's not going to run really well. So this is where the assumptions in the design are wrong. It's not that the design is bad or evil or wrong or against us somehow, but we have to make alterations. So we provide some options. We move some text, we render things at the smallest possible size, we add a decorative line in here to fill up some space, we remove the shadows because they're just not going to work. This and this are not exactly the same, but they communicate the things that they need to communicate. And if we look at the option 2 here, it turns out the customer thinks that it's more important for people to see at the handshake distance what they do and where they're from. Then it turns out that fidelity to this original art is actually less desirable than having larger, legible text that runs cleanly on the fabric that works well. If we continue to beat our heads against this art here, we're going to end up with a poor embroidered result just based on the design. Nothing we do technically will make this text look incredible down here. Now, certainly, if it's on light colored piqué, I could maybe get away with some straight stitch text. Am I going to get this font? Is it going to be this close to everything? Am I going to get these outlines to look great? Very likely not. It's not the best option for us. It's not the most efficient option. It's not going to run the best way it can. Can we get more detail than maybe this? Perhaps. But in this case, the importance of the clarity and the legibility is above the importance of fidelity to the original art. So that's all I'm saying when I'm talking about design. It's not that we can't do other things. It's not that there aren't other ways to handle this. But whenever I bring this question up, it is frequently the case that design is part of this issue, especially when people are new to embroidery, especially when they're new to digitizing. The concept is that just like in digital printing, just like in other mediums, we can bring in our art, convert it into whatever the machine of the day can read, especially in digital printing in sublimation. And generally, when we print it out, it should be okay. With embroidery, that is not the case. With embroidery, it is a knowledge of our materials that makes us able to do this stuff. So the second portion of this, of course, is digitizing. Digitizing is critical, of course, but digitizing alone can't make the result happen. And one of the problems I see pretty frequently is that people have issues with something going on in the design that certainly digitizing can point to things that are potentially wrong. They'll have rippling, they'll have issues with, and actually, I've got some images of some issues that we can talk about here. They'll have issues with like rippling or tacoing, cratering, something getting convex or concave because there's a fair amount of density in it. They'll have issues with wrinkles. They'll have issues with outlines moving around. And somebody will jump to digitizing as the first problem, or especially underlay sticking out. That's another one where sometimes and truthfully, it can be digitizing. Obviously, it can be digitizing. If we don't have enough inset on our underlays, we can have issues with the digitizing that cause us to have underlay pop out. But we can have the same kind of issues to a degree. Certainly, it's more easy to see if it shifts in one direction because we have issues with our hooping, issues with our stabilization, issues with the way we're running or our design. Not only our design, but our machinery not being in good running order if it's happening all the time on all heads, no matter what. But there are things we can look at to kind of analyze that, right? There are issues. So yes, the design can be an issue, but the digitizing, not only can it be an issue, the problem is we can both have the digitizing look like it's the issue when it's something else in the execution, and we can digitize our way around problems. Whenever I talk about this, I have to refer back to my career as an embroiderer, in which I sometimes ran on machines that were not in good working order. And I am absolutely not lying when I say I've run on machines where the two axes, we have the x axis horizontally and we have the y axis vertically as we're looking at the design in front of us. Designs where the two axes were not perfectly balanced and where I was losing width or gaining width in the x while the y axis was at the right size, and where I modified my files so they looked okay, despite the fact that the motors weren't running correctly and the machine wasn't responding correctly. Did that mean that digitizing was the problem with those designs? No. In that case, the machine was operating poorly, and I compensated my digitizing for the poor operation of the machine. And in the end, the embroidered result looked roughly like what I wanted it to. Does it mean that I digitized it incorrectly the first time? Absolutely not. It meant that I was compensating for issues that I was seeing in the stitch out. And I know that sounds wild. You're like, are you serious? You're running this broken machine. In the real world, sometimes we run on non standard hardware. It has happened. I would absolutely recommend anybody who really wants to be in business, if you own the business, get the machine fixed. You're a digitizer in house for a business. You may or may not have the ability to tell your boss that that's the only thing they can do. And they may say, work for it. And you may find, as a young digitizer, as I did, that you decide to digitize around the problems you're having. Does that mean it's the right answer? Not necessarily. It means it achieved the desired result. I'm not going to tell you you should digitize your way around broken machines. I think you should have your machines in running order. What I am going to tell you is when you're looking at someone's problem online where they may have a registration issue, even if digitizing can fix the registration issue, it doesn't always mean digitizing was the root problem of the registration issue. You can digitize your way around a lot. The other example I bring up for this one is I knew a guy who was running a lot of foam fronted trucker hats, and they were the kind that were very unstable. And he was using sometimes up to 100% of excess compensation because all of the satin stitches were sinking in and shrinking to such a degree they were getting incredibly narrow. And he was just adding a ton of compensation, running them quickly, and letting them sink into the foam and pull the foam tight. Is that the way to do it? I don't think so. It causes distortion to the front of the cap. Did it make the columns that were on the hat the width he was expecting them to be? Yes. Yes, it did. He got a desired result. Did it mean that that was the right way? Probably not. Does it mean should he been using some stabilizer or something to help that out? Probably yes. Running the design slower on these super malleable foam fronted hats? Very likely yes. Would he have had a different result on a different hat? 100%. But you can digitize your way around issues that are materials issues that are honestly issues with the operations of the equipment. You can sometimes do that. And you can have the opposite thing happen very consistently. We're talking about digitizing versus execution. People will have a registration issue, meaning they're having an outline that goes off at some point. And what they'll find is that the faster the machine runs, the more they're seeing that distortion because they're getting a little bit of extra tension on the stitch. Or as it runs faster, we're not allowing time for the materials to relax as they're running. And so if you slow the machine way down, suddenly we get our outline to run right where it needs to. But we have to slow the machine down to an incredible rate or slower than we would normally run it, and we end up getting things just matching enough where the outline hits. Whereas if we speed up any, we add a little bit of tension and we add a little bit of extra motion to that piece, we end up where our outlines don't hit. Does that mean digitizing is the issue? No. And in that case, the digitizing, or it can mean the digitizing the issue. We can have digitizing that doesn't have enough compensation for normal operations, and we can execute either on the machine and slow it down a ton, or do the other thing that we see consistently online, which is people slapping more and more and more stabilizer to attempt to make the tension in the stitches not pull the stitches tighter, not cause pull distortion. So that's where the execution is now holding up the digitizing. You can change something in this triumvirate of things that we're showing you here and still not have that necessarily be the reason why things are better or why things went off in the first place, but it can make things look more like the result that you want. That's why I try to discuss this stuff. It isn't just a continuum of what is wrong. That's the thing. It's not always what is wrong. So, I'm gonna bring some stuff up and talk to folks here real quick. By the way, glad to see you in, Susan. Hi, Susan. Justin says tacoing. I think only us in the Southwest use that term. Yeah. When something becomes convex or dishing, or you see a design that it's coming towards you like this, very often if you see this, what you're going to find out, your stitch angle is horizontal. It is perpendicular to that direction of that 3D distortion, that cupping or tacoing. And what you're finding is there's a ton of density in here. There's a lot of this stitching put together. And as these lines of stitching build up, they have to go somewhere and they push the fabric. And as it pushes, it either tacos like that or it'll push out. So it's either convex or concave. It'll buckle out toward you. But yes, that's how it is. And frequently, Ramona says, "It's the digitizing." She says, "I can fix that for you." That is often how we do. And truthfully, the thing that I'll also say is when we have things like registration issues, when we have no other choice, let's say we have no choice but to run with a really light stabilizer, we can compensate our way out of using a material that's non-standard. We can do things, we can slow a machine down a ton to help hit a border on something that's really stretchy or something that's really unstable. That can happen, and if that's okay for our production line and our speeds and what we want for getting our work done, that's fine, right? That's fine. We can make that decision, but it's a decision we make to compensate for one of these, let's say these legs of that table, right? The three legs of the table that we're talking about here being a little short. Well, we compensate it. We work on that to make it even. But that's the issue. We can compensate in multiple directions to get the result we're trying to get. But yeah, every time somebody says it's the digitizing, I can fix it for you. That means there's a digitizer scoping. It's always, yeah, come inbox, PM me. I will help you. I will fix you. I absolutely understand how that is. Folks, it is just the way of the world that somebody is going to try and fix things through digitizing because that is the service they can offer you online. Or the truth of the matter is, what usually happens when I'm dealing with embroiderers is whatever part of this equation that they're the most comfortable with is the part they'll try to fix. If there's somebody who's super comfortable in software and they see these issues happening, maybe like me, honestly, I'm more likely to work on my design to try and make things work than I am to look at the rest of the execution. Now, don't get me wrong, I like to think my execution's all right. What things am I looking out for when I'm putting together a design and working on a piece? Well, hoop tension should be good. I should be arresting motion as much as I can. The hoop should be done correctly. I should be using a stabilizer that matches well with the garment that I'm trying to work on and with the overall with the design that I'm working on, because there is something to the fact that design that has a lot more density, a lot more stitches in it has some issues. Certainly, there's that. And I'm looking to make sure that I'm running at a reasonable speed and that I have my tension set correctly for the thread that I'm running and for the design that I'm working on. So those are all the things that I'm working on. Plus, admittedly, then the digitizing is going to be part of that. My sequencing is not only efficient, but make sure that I'm not traveling too far away from something before I run an outline on it, especially on really large pieces or on hats. I'm sequenced correctly for the garment. We know that on hats and on super unstable garments, centering out is a great idea, and on hats, bottom up, center out. So from the most stable part of the hat up and out is how we generally do that work. And honestly, I'm usually making sure that all of that other stuff is taken care of first. I'm going to make sure I have a stable platform. Everything is stabilized correctly. The fabric is not stretching too much. It is not loose in the hoop. The hoop is not allowing for any sliding. The garment is properly hooped. The hoop itself is properly engaged in the machine. Machine is centered correctly. Speed is set right. Bobbin spring is clean. Top tension is correct. Threading is correct, and all of that stuff is working. Machine is in running order and maintained, and the hooping is right, and it's not too tight or too loose, not overly stretched, or is it loose in general. That's what I'm doing before I even get started and before I run my sample. Barrier to entry, you have to be able to hoop correctly, have your material correctly stabilized, and have your machine in working order. That's one of the other issues. So and it's also why I talk about people buying kind of used broken machines to start out. If you don't have to, by all means, don't. Buy a machine that you know is in good working order. Have a known good file and watch it run if you're going to buy used, because your machine can be having some input into how your design turns out. And if you're brand new, you may not know that. Or if you're brand new to digitizing, you may not know that what you're doing on screen, even if you're compensating for it, isn't necessary except for on a machine that has a problem. These can be the problems. But yeah, that's the thing. When we're looking at this stuff, I'm hoping my execution is tight enough that I'm getting things run. If I have designs I know have run before and I can make them run on that garment combination, then awesome. Then when I'm testing, any problems that I see are likely to be digitizing problems because I have the execution locked down as much as I can. And if you're someone who's brand new, you do that execution with the design that you've seen somebody run that runs really well. That's just how it is. So it's one of those things. It just depends on what you do, and that's some of the issues, right? It's just how it is. And Ramona's making a joke here, which I love. She's talking about what some of the answers we see online, right? So before you guys all answer Ramona and tell her she's wrong, she's joking about what you usually see. On this four color 10,000 stitch file, use three cutter layers, a fusible tearaway, and a topper, but it still curls. That's the thing. You see these commentaries pretty frequently where people are trying to compensate the way they can. Why do people compensate like this? Here's the thing. I'm gonna take the kind of sting out of this and say it's funny for us to watch this who've been in the business for a long time. But why would someone who doesn't digitize add all this stabilizer when they're having a problem? Because those are the things that they can control. And hey, I make fun of this comment all the time too, where people are adding massive stacks where they're building up a layer of corrugated cardboard under their design because they're trying to, laminate the thing out of existence, the problems and difficulties that they have. But that's the thing, right? When people have these super heavy designs in small areas and they punch a lot of density all in the same place, it's also why I talk about three-dimensional distortion, not just two-dimensional. We all know as you jam all these needles through, we're distorting things in 3 dimensions, not just two. That's why we get the cupping and the dishing, because we have a full woven piece of material or knit piece of material that fully covers the person behind it. Now we're going to jam a bunch of little wedges inside of it and it'll spread out. But this is the thing, when they're seeing this design, and this is the first part, the assumption is if I bought a stock design from someone, or if I hired someone who advertised to me that they were a professional digitizer and know what they're doing, their design should be correct. If their design is correct, if their design is right, and that's the assumption we make, that they know what they're doing, then my input must be what's causing the problem. It's what you said earlier, honestly, Ramona. What am I doing wrong? Might not be you. This is where the digitizing can be the problem. But the thing is, when they don't have anything else to control, all they can do is apply materials or execution solutions. What can they do? Well, it's distorting too much. I'm going to throw more backing under it. The texture is not exactly what I expected, maybe because the person who digitized it didn't think about shoring up the edges, or we're getting some sawtoothing, or honestly, some of my assumptions are wrong, and I don't like just the natural edge that embroidery has that is not a perfect knife edge like printing might be. And so what do? We add a bunch of materials to it trying to solve the problem because we don't know to go back to the digitizer necessarily, or we think that the digitizer's right, or the digitizer has said they're right. Maybe they've even showed us a sample on some material that's not analogous to what we're running. So some material that's not the same as what we're running is what they're looking at. And so their design came out right and they must be right, especially if we're new to this job, new to this work. And so what do? We try and arrest the movement. We can tell that there's some shifting. We can tell there's some wrinkling. I assume it's because the material is moving, shifting, puckering. And if that's the case, you try and arrest it. And how can you arrest it if you don't know anything else about what you're doing with digitizing? You throw more backing under it. You throw stabilizer under it. You add more layers of cutaway. You add more layers of whatever. You tighten the hoop, or you stretch the heck out of your material, thinking that the tighter that I hoop it, the less likely it is to move, which is to a degree true. But then we have the recoil of the stretch material falling back toward the design that is now locked in that stretch state. And then we get wrinkles and ripples all around it anyway, because we've overstretched our material. But that's the thing. I want to say this, even when I'm seeing somebody who's having these problems, I don't want to demonize what they're doing. I want folks to understand, much as it may be funny to me, or I might be frustrated because somebody is sharing these tips or telling someone else to do this who doesn't know. Someone who's figured this out on their own and managed to at least make their design run the way they want, even though it means it's super thick and doesn't feel good on a human being. Uh, they have decided to tell this tip to everyone else and say, use 15 layers of different backings and stacks and glue them all together. But at the same time, that the reason people do that is because they don't know what else to do, or they don't have access to the other portion of it, or they don't know that they have the ability or the wherewithal to make those changes. So people who are getting digitizing done by someone else, people who are buying stock designs, they frequently do what honestly makes us giggle. And I agree, Ramona, I giggle too, and start throwing tremendous amounts of like cutaway material in the backing, or a bunch of fusibles or adhesives and toppers to try and solve the problem, when what's probably going on is something else that's in the stack. Either they're having issue with their hoops, and here's something I'm going to be very honest with: a lot of home hoops, rectangular hoops, have weak sides. What I mean by that is if you grab the material, like hoop something in a rectangular hoop, standard hoop, non-magnetic. So we're not getting even tension around. The magnets aren't holding it together. Hoop something in a rectangular hoop, even the commercial ones. And if you pull on the garment, you pull on the material around the edges, grab little bits of the material that's hooped and pull on it. You're going to find that on the long sides of any of those rectangles, that material shifts. It's not tight. It's why so many of us use additional clamps. It's why so many of us use additional tools. It's why magnetic hoops have been so lauded, because you can have a nice big square or rectangular area that has tension all the way around it, holding that material, keeping it from shifting. But invariably on those rectangular hoops, you've got tension in the corners. They're pinched really tight in all the little corners, and on the long and short sides, usually, but especially on the long sides. 5x7 hoops on home machines are notorious from my experience dealing with folks who have them. The old, like the PE770s, the little home machines. People will have their 5x7 hoop, or they'll get the extended hoop or the multi-position hoop, and those sides are really weak. If they're not clipped or clamped or somehow otherwise held down, you're going to find that your stabilizer and your material moves a little more easily than toward the corners. And the thing is, in order to try and fix that, they are throwing a ton of stabilizer, thinking it's the material that's bunching in the center. They're trying to arrest it. And it probably might work to some degree, because what they might do is add so much thickness to that material that it's pinching somewhere else, or they're putting strips of material directly underneath that, the area that's not stable, and it might actually help. But what they're actually having problems with is hoop tension. And that's why we have to realize this is kind of a holistic thing, right? That's why we look at all these three legs of what's going on. We look at design and digitizing and execution. Design certainly is less of it for a lot of folks because they're not doing the graphic design themselves. But as you know, you make details that are too small, you make text that is too small to run. And the chances are, no matter what you do, if you don't make alterations for the medium, you're always going to get a bad result, or at least a result that's not as good as you want it to be, because we're going outside of the envelope of what embroidery can safely or cleanly do, particularly with the standard 40 weight thread, 75, 11, 60, 10 needles, uh, working on most materials, especially something that has a little bit of texture. Digitizing being the other thing. And where we have issues digitizing, certainly a lot of it comes down to assumptions. I talked about this earlier, assumptions of what software does automatically. And honestly, the fact that people don't really know the why behind what's going on in the digitizing software. They learn the buttons without learning what the differences are, what's going on. And frequently that's about assumptions that software is going to immediately adjust to whatever they're doing, or that there aren't adjustments that need to be made for things like unstable materials, materials with a thicker pile. Or if we take some design that, even if it is a native design, and we shrink it down to the absolute minimum it'll run, or we blow it up to the maximum that we can get it in our hoop, that nothing will have to change about our execution or our settings to make that work. A lot of the assumptions are there, even if we're not digitizing, we're just editors, and we're not people who digitize ourselves. It can happen where people get, I know I hate to say this, but sometimes you have that enough knowledge to be dangerous kind of thing, where you know how to run the software a bit, you know how to do some things, you learn how to do a little bit of the work, but without the understanding of the materials and what all the measurements mean, we can have issues. Same thing happens with density pretty frequently. This is one with a lot of early digitizers when it really is a digitizing issue. They continually have coverage issues, and what actually happens is they're increasing the numbers that are in their density when the number is actually measuring the spacing between the lines. Most density numbers, whether they're embroidery points or in millimeters, we're measuring the spacing between lines of thread, meaning that a higher number means less stitches. And they don't look at the stitch count or do what I call the pre-flight. That's something I always talk about, the pre-flight, which is looking at your final design, looking at stitch counts, looking at how something turns out after you save it to the machine file your machine's going to read, opening it back up and taking a look before you run it. They don't look at the pre-flight, and they don't realize that despite the fact that they've tweaked a number in a direction that they think should make the difference, unfortunately they're using the wrong assumption of how density works, and so they're actually lessening the amount of thread that's being used for the coverage. Or they don't know that the underlay is part of the coverage too. And like I said, I'm going to show you some other images of things and discuss these different pegs that go together. But frequently, these assumptions we make are part of the issue. In the design space, it's assumptions about what embroidery can do, and those can be assumptions our customers have that we don't challenge them on. In the digitizing space, it can be assumptions about what the software is doing for us, or just assumptions about how software works, or how terminology works, or what the tools are supposed to do for us, rather than what we need to get as a result, what stitches should be there and what we should expect out of them. And in the execution side, it's often that we do things to compensate that might be kind of compromising the overall quality of our work, but might or might not make a difference to how things actually run. Like I said, you can stabilize something by adding a tremendous amount of stabilizer to it and have the outlines hit where they need to be. But it doesn't mean that it's a good embroidered result or the best embroidered result, even if the outlines in the design hit where they should be. If, let's say, digitizing should have had more compensation, or if we should have changed the design to make the outlines thick enough, or something else to run in the kind of stitches we want. There's multiple ways to attack almost any problem. We got a couple of good comments here, so let me bring those in really quickly. Lisa says, it's the double-edged sword of our tribe, so helpful and want to pay back by offering something that worked for them, but may not address the original cause of the problem. 100%. 100%. That, and the other thing that we do, this is the other double-edged sword. Many of us are creative people, even in the commercial side of this, where if you are dyed in the wool commercial, you know that part of what you have to do is make sure you are efficient enough and that your designs run quickly enough that you can make money, that you can pay people to be there to do the job, whether that's you or somebody else or a lot of somebody else's. You have to be able to make things efficient enough to run for you and to make your profit margin make sense. And frequently, I've seen people who give really great answers to how to make a beautiful art piece that really don't make sense in a shop. And one of those things is where we do a tremendous amount of handwork on a piece that we're not making a lot of money on. I see that consistently, and that's an execution issue. So bring that back up again. One of the other issues we can have with execution is that, let's say we're having an issue with applique. We're doing hand cut appliques, and these appliques are not covering on the edge. They're not quite right. We're not getting a good coverage, and the appliques are not. We're ending up with extra material outside of our embroidered area, outside of our whatever cover stitching we're going to use. And if someone decides as an answer to that to do a tremendous amount of hand cutting and hand trimming, or to move from, let's say, using a plotter cutter to cutting everything by hand, and they don't account for the amount of labor it takes, when they could have talk to a digitizer about increasing the inset on the applique itself, making the cover stitching maybe a little wider. Maybe we don't have quite enough compensation, adding some slop so that our positioning doesn't have to be that perfect. And instead, what they do is go and trim tiny threads all around it on every single piece they do by hand. Yes, they may have achieved what they needed to achieve, but at the cost of their profit margins or at the cost of a tremendous amount of excess labor that could have been handled. Especially, this is, like I said, this is frequently when people aren't digitizers, they don't have access to digitizing. This is something where the digitizer could have made some differences in the file that make a difference, and that could help. Or when we have some weird assumptions like any applique material I use with the default applique settings in my software will work ideally. The settings in your software, no matter what you're doing, even if the software is very good at having a middle ground set of settings that make sense, even if it has automation to help you, are not necessarily what you need for your project. It may require testing on the materials that you intend to run on to find out that you need to make some small alterations to the settings. One of these big ones is underlay popping out. Just because the edge run underlay pops out, if you need an edge run underlay that runs just inside the edge of a filled object or a satin column, if you need that and want that to shore up the edge of the underlay, I can't tell you how many times somebody has said, pull the underlay out when it's popping out of the edge, when you could have inset it a little further, expanded the column slightly because we're actually seeing some pull distortion where we want to compensate, where actually our lines aren't as thick as they should be. That's a question you have to ask yourself. Are those lines the thickness that I want them to be? Uh, or we could work on the sequencing and see what's going on, or change the underlay style. Instead, there are tons of people who just go, what's that? Edge run underlay's popping out? Take it out. Whereas sometimes that underlay is useful to us structurally, and we might want to preserve it, and we can by changing sometimes a simple setting, the inset value for how close to the edge of our stitching that underlay runs. Just because you jump into your software, type out some text, and send it to the machine does not mean that all the settings are ideal for your particular embroidery from the get-go. That's an assumption. And that's one of the problems that happens when we go, especially from the concept of, like, back in the day, we could have called it desktop publishing. That is not really a term that gets thrown around now. But when we think about print in general or digital layout, where we type something, we print it out, and it is the way we expect it to be, in embroidery, there is usually a portion of alteration, a portion of interpretation where we have to work on our settings. So that can actually be part of that. And that's part of that assumption issue that we have. And I think that's part of the issue. And another comment, might as well bring this in. Marianne says, I've noticed that embroidery is not 100% embroidery. Client may have to steam press that shirt to flatten the design. It will curl, and I'll let them know. No, and that's true. Sometimes really heavy embroideries are going to distort a little bit over time, and that's just the way they are. That, and you'll find that on light materials, if you add a super heavy material or a super heavy embroidery on a light material, we have to imagine we're weaving in a large amount of fiber. It is heavy, it is stiffer than the surrounding material. It will move differently than the material around it. But that's also where we get into the digitizing and the design side, where when we're working on super light materials, we should aim to reduce densities, we should aim to reduce coverage if we can, and think about what designs work well for the combination of all the things we're putting together. I think that's the problem in the commercial world, is that frequently we have the same logo and the same art that we're trying to apply to everything. Whereas if you look at designs done for, let's say, the retail space, for the fashion space, for home decor, usually the design portion of this is part of everything where they're making an entire object, right? When they do their design work, they're not designing a logo and then putting it on a garment as if those are two different things. They are designing a thing, a garment that is decorated, made of this material in these colors. When you're designing that, a treatment, if you will, then you are designing for the material with the execution in mind in the medium that you're expecting to use. And you're doing this all together as a holistic adventure, as something that's done all in one, all serving one purpose, not supposed to be cut and paste everywhere you go. However, in the commercial world, we're frequently called upon to put the same logo, the same logo type, the same image on different substrates, on different items. And we have to adjust as much as we can without losing the look of the original piece. Whereas not the same. In fashion, if you're on something super light, the likelihood of putting an incredibly heavy embroidery is not as likely. They're going to use lighter embroideries, they're going to use lower densities, they're going to use lighter designs unless there is some reason why they want a super heavy look on a lighter garment. There is something to that. Sometimes we are charged, especially in the commercial embroidery world, with doing that work, where we have to take something that's unsuited and make it work as best we can. But I'd like to go ahead, as we're getting up to the hour here, rather than go really long without talking about anything else. I wanted to kind of discuss some of this stuff. Like I said, we already have gone over the three legs of this stool: design, digitizing, and execution. Any one of these things can affect our final end of this design, and what comes out to can affect our outcome. But here are some of the things I want to make clear, certainly. Design matters because we can design for our medium. We can do something that I would like to say is we can work towards suitability, right? We say fitness. Fitness is one of the things that often gets thrown around in my articles, but that's me trying to, allude to the fact that, an animal lives best when it's in the environment that it is made for. But this is the idea: suitability. Not every design is equally well suited to every size, execution, every type of material that's out there. The best thing we can do in design is to design both for our medium. So design for the medium, design for embroidery, text that's large enough to stitch in the kinds of thread that we are going to use, and also embroidering on the kind of materials that we assume will be embroidered on. We want to design for that as much as we can. So designing for the medium is a big deal. Like I said, suitability and fitness also have to do with arriving at the result that we want. And we're talking about a customer. We know we've had this discussion before. Last week we really talked about it quite a lot. It depends on what the customer is trying to do. If a customer is trying to celebrate something for their family, that's a very different look than if they're trying to look professional on a uniform than if they're trying to make a fashion piece. These are very different results they're looking for. uh, how far away something's supposed to be read from, who's going to be wearing it, the kind of material conditions they'll be under, if something is going to be snagged or rubbed against something rough or otherwise treated roughly. Well, you can't use the same stitch types as you would use for something that will never be washed. And frankly, your materials are going to change for that too. You can use rayons and other kinds of threads and cottons and wool blends in places that aren't going to get industrial laundry. You do that in a hospital setting and you're going to have a bad day. Now we want polyester. And if we're going to be outside, we might want matte finish polyester because we have to have UV light fast, color fastness in the light and not to dry rot and break, which if you're out here in New Mexico or Arizona, we all know that things out in the sun will fade and literally turn to dust over time. Plastics don't always hold up. So it is fitness, it is suitability that we're working on. And that is in all parts. It's in our design, certainly, but it's also in designing the treatment, which means the materials we use, the design we're using, and truthfully, to some degree, the way we digitize in order to make that happen. These are all together. But in our design, the biggest thing is we want to design for the medium. And we want to do things like use safe text. Stitch types should be assigned to lines and shapes that are the proper thickness for them and that make the most sense. Certainly, we can use different stitch types in different ways for artistic means, but certainly we want things that are safe to run well, reliably, and to stitch well, not break threads, things like that. Certainly, when we're talking about our digitizing, a lot of this is it's analysis, it's understanding what the design needs from our digitizing, it's understanding the medium, it's understanding the material that we're working on and interpreting our art in the best way we can for embroidery. So honestly, we have to know a lot about execution. We have to know a lot about materials. So these things are holistic. This all goes together. If any part of this is not attended to, we may not get the best results we can. And the other thing I would say is that we should be very clear in digitizing about our assumptions about what's on screen. Can't say it enough. The screen is lying to you. The settings that are there on screen, the defaults that are there may not be what you need. And most certainly the art that you import from some vector that's made for print, the art that you bring in from some other medium often will not have the shapes or almost never has the shapes that you need for embroidery because we have to make differences to the shapes to make the layering correct, to make the sequence correct, to adjust for pull and push compensation, to adjust for the natural stresses that are present in embroidery. If we make assumptions that what we bring in and the default settings in our software are exactly what we need, then when we test, we will find out if those assumptions are correct or not. And that doesn't mean that the software is wrong, that the digitizing necessarily is badly done. It means we probably have to adjust for the outcome that we've actually hit. And that's also the thing when we talk about automation and technology. Automation is fantastic where it takes busy work away from us, but when it takes away our creative impulse, that's not great. And if we make assumptions about what should and shouldn't work out of the box without really knowing enough about our embroidery, without knowing enough about our materials, the chances are we're not going to have the results we want. The good thing is we can find the solution by testing. So that's where I always talk about that sampling. Sampling, sampling, sampling. I sampled everything. I'd still sample everything or have someone else sample everything when I can't do it. Sampling is important. And in the best cases, you're going to want to sample on the material that the design was intended for. If you're doing something for stock designs, you may not be able to do that. You're going to have to find a happy medium ground, something that is a little stretchy, a little bit textured, and maybe not super thin or super thick. But at the same time, you know that that is not going to be every result that people are going to get when they use it on any material out there. When we're doing something commercially or for ourselves, the best thing we can do is sample in the way we're going to run the eventual design using the stabilizers we intend to run that are the right stabilizers for the design. We can start by looking at the manufacturers because they usually have a good set of assumptions as to if we have a design that has a ton of stitches in it, if we are running on a particular kind of material, what stabilizer they intend for us to use. But in the end, the only way to prove things out is sampling. The produce of a digitizer is not the file. The produce of a digitizer is the embroidery, and the file doesn't matter up until the point that it creates the proper embroidery. I know every time you'll hear it from me. As many times as you listen to me, you'll probably hear it that many times. The produce of the digitizer is embroidery, not the file. The file is a middle ground. And honestly, that which is rough because that means for those of us who make files for people who are going to run these things in their own machines on their own fabric, it means that we really don't know how successful they are until someone else runs them. That's the truth, but they may have other issues and we can talk to them about their way of diagnosing. But yeah, sampling is huge. And when you don't understand your settings or your materials, swatch testing. Test things on new materials. If you just get materials in, test your new stabilizers with a known design that you can use as a benchmark and test settings. Run little swatches of different settings in different stitch types to see what they do until you zero in on the way you want things to look and write these things down. Record your information. It's important. And the other part of testing and all of this, when we're talking about execution and digitizing, but especially execution, watching. When you first do any sort of new technique, when you're working on a new material, watch the design run. And I do mean sit there and watch it. And I know I'm not going to say that if you're doing a gigantic 100 plus thousand stitch jacket piece that has a lot of fill area in it, you're not going to watch literally every stitch run on those. Have I done that before? Absolutely. I have sat at a machine for multiple hours at a time. When it's critical, when it has to be right, sometimes it's what we have to do. But especially when we're learning new materials, especially when we're learning new techniques, watching the design run like a hawk as it's running is how we're going to see the way that things distort, if something's shifting in the hoop. And the other thing is, this helps so much with execution. If you walk away from a machine, you can't tell if the material was bunching up along a particular angle just because of the stitch directions, or if there was something wrong with the hoop. Did the hoop come loose a little bit? Did the hoop bump into something? There's a lot of people who are running in home shops where they have a real tight space around their machines. And if something is in the way, they may have literal interference from the hoop running into something and it distorting a little bit. That does absolutely happen. I have seen it happen. I've seen hoops come loose from their clips. I have seen people run things where they also didn't notice that the hoop was starting to loosen up. And as the design was going on, the material was shifting in a particular direction because of the way the hoop was loose or because of the shifting that was natural to the type of hoop they were using. If they had been watching it while it ran, they would know. And that's the thing. We have to, it's not just sampling, it's about testing. I always talk about smart testing. If you haven't seen my earlier posts or classes about that, we can talk about that again later. But smart testing, in essence, we sample, we measure. So we sample something out, we look at it, we measure things that are off. So if we have things that are incorrect, we measure what's wrong. We literally look at are the widths the way they should be, gaps that appear and how big they are. We analyze what went wrong. We look at stitch angles. We look at pull and push distortion and see what happened. If we've taken good notes, we watched it, we can talk about this or make notes to ourselves about the sequence, about when things slid out of place, how the fabric bunched, what angles were causing issues, what stitches were causing issues. We we revise. That's our R in smart. We revise the logo, the element, the design we're working on, adjusting things for the measurements that we're seeing in the hoop that are off. And we test again. That's how we do this. We do cycles of the smart testing, and that will get us to our result quickly. But it means we have to watch. It means we have to be present for that stuff. And it means we have to kind of control our environments. This is the other thing about the scientific mindset. When I talk about being scientific stitchers, it means we sample things on the kind of materials we intend to run them on. And when we make changes, we try and control those environments. We don't change everything all at once. We look for and try and figure out what the thing is that we can make the difference with, and we control the environments. And it's all about kind of the assumptions we make and what we think. And when we're doing this analysis, we're doing kind of a post mortem on a design that hasn't turned out exactly how we want it to. There are certainly things we can look for. I'm not going to belabor the point too much, but we can look for things that are wrong. It's pretty easy to tell if it's design. If something is just packed full of details and we've put too much details in it, yes, it might be a digitizing problem, but it's also a design issue we might have to deal with, tell somebody, tell our customer, tell our client, or tell ourselves that we're just not going to get every detail in the world in a small space. We're not going to run 1.5 millimeter text in a satin stitch. It's just not likely to happen, and we need to make some alterations there. For digitizing, the big one is thread breaks. People always ask me, how can I tell why thread breaks are happening? A couple things we can say if it's digitizing or execution. Usually when it's digitizing, it's because we have a buildup of thread or really small stitches on top of each other. And generally it's going to happen in the same place or close to the same place every time, or close to every time is going to continually happening that way. The only thing that I will caution people on with saying that if the thread breaks every time in the same place, it's always the digitizing. That seems like it can be the case. However, if you're on a garment that has a really heavy seam and you're hitting that seam even on a multi-head machine, that seam is always hitting around in the same place of the design over and over again. Caps are a big one for this, 6-panel caps for the central seam. It can be interference from the seam and going through the multiple layers of material that causes that thread break to continually happen over the seam, even though it seems like it's in the same place every time, in the same location in the design. That may be a materials problem, not a digitizing problem. But if you're running on a flat and there is nothing that should be obstructing it and we're breaking thread at the same place every time, the likelihood is you have little tiny stitches that you need to filter out or adjust for. That is very likely then a digitizing problem. If it's the file, it should be happening fairly reliably at the same location in the file if there's a problem. That doesn't still mean that you couldn't have something happening like shifting every time at the same place in the design and have that be execution because your hoop's not tight enough in the sides, or because you have some other execution you've done incorrectly, haven't used stabilize or something else, and so that's shifting. And it's a combination of the digitizing pulls right at that place because we've got a lot of stitches on that angle that are drawing in one spot, and because you have something going on where you're not stabilizing enough. That can totally happen. So it's not always the same thing, but especially thread breaks. I always tell people if the thread break is due to digitizing, it's going to be where we've packed a lot of detail in one spot, and it should continually be happening at that space, regardless over whether it's traveling over a seam or not. Though that can certainly cause more interference. So with that, folks, I'm going to show a couple of images and we'll talk about a couple other things as we get done. And then we'll just finish that stuff too. So we'll take a look here. But let's go ahead and grab a couple more comments before we show the images. Ramona says, another one, I want to put this 200,000 stitch solid filled design file on the front of a summer weight t-shirt. I have absolutely turned down a job for this reason. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy. I had somebody who came in, it was a car club that had a really detailed design, and they wanted it on the back of what we can call an undershirt. It was a very, very lightweight shirt. It was an incredibly heavy embroidered design. I did show them some options where I lightened up the fills, where I lightened up the design, where I only applied the outlines of the design and tried to make the artwork in a different style. They didn't like that. They wanted fully filled art. And I finally said no because there was no way that this incredibly light shirt would hold up, or I was going to have to put so much stabilizer in it that I could not, in good conscience, tell somebody to put this on their body because I'm like, you're not going to like the way it feels. You're not going to enjoy it. And I turned the job down, and I'm going to tell you this person pulled out a stack of money, and I mean literal money, and very angrily said, "How much money will it take for you to do what I want you to do?" And started skinning off money. Now, I did tell them this was not the problem. It was a weird example of what can happen to you in your shop, but it was absolutely a time where I'm like, it is not money that's causing this not to be possible. It is the materials that's causing this not to be possible, and I can't make this work well. And I don't want to be the person that makes you shirts that look bad, that don't feel good, that you're going to sweat to death, and you're going to scratch the top layer of skin off of your back. So sometimes it just doesn't work out, and that's the worst. And Ramona says, and this is absolutely how we used to learn to do stock designs. A wise man once told me, for the most part, if you digitize for piqué fabric, it will look okay for most other fabrics. That has been my experience. Is this 100% the truth? It depends on how far away your fabric is from piqué. If you go run on super lightweight, a single layer of lightweight organza with no stabilizer, digitizing for piqué is a very bad idea. However, for stock designs, one layer of light, like medium cutaway, and a slightly textured, slightly thick cotton piqué is about what a lot of stock designs run well on. It's about how much distortion is put into stock designs. And if you run a stock design on a piqué polo shirt, especially the old school ones who have been running around the business for some time, you'll find they probably run pretty well because that's kind of where they fall. Does it mean it's something you should put into practice on purpose? It's a little bit of texture, it's a little bit of thickness, it's a little bit of stretch. It's probably an okay middle point. It doesn't mean it's the best way always, for sure. And Joanne says, I'm known for repeating the phrase, it's always best to test. That's a great one. Yeah. That's also Lisa Shaw, always live and die by the sample. So that is the way it is. And Marianne says, when I see on Digitizer question of fabric we're using, it's a very important question. Yeah. If you ask a Digitizer to do a design for you and they don't ever ask about the fabric you're using, you should probably understand that they're not going to be very careful. In fact, what are they going to do? They're going to digitize that probably for that kind of middle ground, like we talked about here. And yeah, as for the kind of shirt, Marianne, yes, that's the kind. We're going to call it an undershirt. If you were on the live feed, you're watching the video, you get to know what that shirt is called around here and what I don't like to call it. But yes, a lightweight undershirt that they wanted a whole lot of stitching on the back. That is something that I don't want to do. In any case, I'm going to go ahead and share my second screen. So we're in bonus time now. I'm just going to talk about a few things, and we're not going to belabor this point too much. I think we've gotten to most of it, but I'm going to share a few things that I've had uh, in discussing this kind of topic with folks before, in discussing these kinds of issues, uh, where we sometimes have interactions that we don't necessarily see, and they can even be pretty small. This is one that I like to bring up. And actually, I'm editing my album, unfortunately. Let's close that out. So this is one I like to show, where sometimes direction and stitching can make a massive difference to edge quality. Right here, what we're looking at, and admittedly, this is an older garment at this point, is a little roughed up, but this is standard embroidery weight thread. This is 40 weight embroidery thread on a piece of t-shirt knit. So this is jersey knit. We are zoomed in really tight. But what I want to explain to people is sometimes edge quality really has a lot to do with the grain. As you can see, because we have in this grain of the knit, we have this really vertical grain here. um, Obviously, when we have our stitches lining up vertically, they're going to sometimes fall in the grain. They're going to fall into those vertical ribs that are in that knit. And so we get a little bit of a rougher edge on a satin stitch that is purely vertical, aligning exactly with that edge, than we do on the horizontal. As you can see, where it's horizontal, the one problem we have is it likes to grab onto a rib of that knit. And you'll see that there's some places where it tracks into the middle. And if you zoom in even further, you can actually see how it's tracking into the center of that rib as it grabs the rib. And so we get little kind of deviations in the edge due to that. But we overall have a cleaner edge on that horizontal stitch than we do on the vertical because of the interaction with the fabrics. That's where we're having an issue with the medium. And sometimes that's not something they're saying, I'm getting these rough edges. It looks like crud. What should I do? And sometimes the issue we're having is a materials issue, where on a fabric with a grain on it, we're going to have some issues like that. That's the same thing here. We're looking at a fill stitch, and this is the same density settings, the same compensation, same everything from the left to the right side. Now there is an underlay under here, so there is not an underlay that's making this look any better. These are just bare fill stitches, but it looks like we have more coverage on the left-hand side than the right. And that is really due to that fall in effect. It looks darker. This doesn't look as good. We have a difference between the way that the light's reflecting, for one, but secondarily, we're getting this kind of texture because the ribs are more to the front because the stitching is falling down into that vertical rib to some degree. So we're going to notice that stitch angle can have a difference in how things execute. And this is once again an assumption that we might not make, right? That's an assumption we might not make when we're just looking at our pieces, that our stitch angle can make such a difference when when it interacts with our material. That's why I always call this thing holistic. And I'm not saying you're going to change all your stitch angles forever. What I'm saying is sometimes you might have to use some underlays to shore things up, and that you might also learn to live with a little bit of texture where you're falling directly along a grain of a fabric. Some of the other things that can happen like that, I'm going to show this piece. If you haven't seen me show this before, I really like this piece. It's a piece I did for my wife that is it's an Urnus style Viking Age art piece that I redrew from a seal of that era. And so we have this Urnus style beast. It's an interlaced beast. You can see the head and the eye here. You can see kind of the shoulder here and the legs of the beast that are all intertwined. So it's kind of a zoomorphic interlaced piece that I did. However, what you're going to see is this was done on extremely heavy, coarse canvas, recycled materials. And even though it's tone on tone, you're going to see that we've got this sawtoothing and what people even would call pixelation. No matter what underlay you use, if you're working on something that is this coarse, even with a sharp needle, there's a chance of you tracking on these incredibly heavy woven materials like this. And this is actually something I see pretty frequently with people working on patches, where they decide they want a stiff patch, and rather than adding a stiffener or adding a layer of heat seal adhesive after, they use a really, really coarse material because they know, that thick, coarse material, that cotton duck, that heavy material is stiff. And then they try and put the incredibly fine detail that we have on badges and patches and emblems that get really small. They try and put that fine detail in, and they find that their needle is tracking all over the place, and we get these rough edges. Well, these rough edges, this pixelation, this sawtoothing, is due to an interaction between, as we can see, this woven material and the needle. We can see that those lines where we break up and have that kind of pixelated look, it's falling directly on the weave. That is exactly on the weave. That's because our needle is, though it is doing its best to try and punch through that heavy material, we are getting some deflection of the needle, and it's bending and going to either side of that heavy coarse weave. And when that happens, we're going to have textural issues like this. And no amount of digitizing operation or no sharp needle is likely to make this entirely disappear on an extremely heavy piece. And what I'm going to say is also, you can see where we're going in directions that don't interface too much with that angle, where they're not close to that angle. When we don't have this shallow kind of angle where it cuts right across it, you're not seeing the stair stepping nearly as much. It's when your angle almost matches the angle that we're in on that weave. And in this case, it's a horizontal that really has the problems. The vertical doesn't have the same kind of issues as these big horizontal ribs that you can see. It's where we almost match that, where we start to track where the needle wants to stay in that track, because it's too many. There are too many stitches that are close to one side or the other and want to track along. And that's just one of those things. Could we change the art? Maybe, probably not great. In this case, this is a tote bag. I can't change the orientation too much and make it work. I could, if I wanted to. I made this for myself. If I really wanted to, I could have tilted the entire artwork a little bit. It would have just meant that some of the lines that aren't pixelated or sawtoothed now would have looked that way anyway. But if we look at the piece up close, you can see some of that distortion and how it's tracking on those horizontals, right? It's just how it is. We have those really big, heavy ribs, and that's what it's going to do. In this case, somebody might tell you that's a digitizing issue, and I'm going to tell you right now it is not. This is a material interaction issue. Certainly, we could use a stout needle, it's sharp, and try our best to punch it through. In this case, with a tone-on-tone piece that was on a recycled bag that is supposed to look, I would say rustic is a nice way of putting it. A little bit of sawtoothing, a little bit of tracking where it almost looks like counted stitch to me was fine. And because I was making that piece for myself, I have the desire and the will to say that was what I intended. When I first saw it running, do you think I was entirely pleased that it was sawtoothing? Absolutely not. When I show anybody else this piece and I don't tell them about it, maybe embroiderers say something. Mostly everybody just goes, "Oh, that's super cool. Where'd you get that tote bag? Who did that design? What is that? Is that a Viking thing, Eric, since you do Viking things?" And that's the way it goes. The judgment is certainly different to the actual audience than it is to us. However, would I call that successful edge quality? If I were doing that for a logo, I'd probably be a little unhappy and I would talk to the customer about any number of things. Certainly, one of them being, is it that important for us to have this incredibly heavy, coarse bag be the piece that we embroider? Could I affix a patch to the bag so I can do finer work and then affix the patch on top? Could I do something else to mitigate that problem, even if we wanted to use this material? Because stitching directly through it, I am much more likely to have that kind of interaction. So, like I said, a lot of these have to do with that kind of interaction. This is another one where digitizing can't save everything. Certainly, we had some issues where if you look at it, it looks like this piece is crooked. The truth of the matter is, when you look at the way this military has put together, it has the band is actually thinner over here on the sides than it is in the center. And if you have a logo that is laid out like this kind of a design issue, looks very crooked. But if you look at the top seam is not crooked to the top of the design. But when we have a crooked, curved band that changes thickness, well, there's a part where this logo, unless I try and go too high for the rest of the piece, and at least higher than the customer wanted it, this logo is going to interface with that seam and probably look a little shoddy unless I change it. But this is where we're in this balance of the logo has tiny text, it has tiny detail on it. And if we have, pardon me, if we have that logo, this text, this layout, and this hat, we're probably at a point where we have to make a choice as to which thing we're going to give up. And in the case of this particular hat, I believe we switched the hat brand to get something that didn't have the same kind of super heavy seam on this. But a lot of the military hats, they've got a seam here that has to be contended with. And frankly, I know a lot of folks who just don't care. They run this text a little closer to that seam and they run right over the logo anyway. In this case, customer didn't love it. And the other problem was that the visual look of this curved line down here from the kind of extra thickness of the seam made the design look crooked no matter what we did. And in that case, we're having an interaction between the kind of garment, the design itself, and the way we execute. And there was almost nothing we could do to make what honestly is a lopsided logo. The text with large logo to one side looks a little lopsided. It's always going to look heavy. Your eye is going to see the weight of that logo kind of dragging down that side, and it causes issues. So this is a piece where though the stitching was okay, maybe not the best stitching on earth, but for really tiny text, I wasn't super unhappy with it. The combination of the hat itself, the way the hat was constructed, the design itself, all together goes together to say, even if I digitize this in a different way, if I worked on it and tried to make everything perfect, the likelihood is that the overall look would be something that a customer would still find to be imbalanced. So holistic stuff, folks. And here's just some fun stuff too. This piece, and actually, I don't have a better version of this one, unfortunately. Um, I need to make a new version of this. I just want to show you. We talk about art that people bring us. If you take a look at this piece, and like I said, actually, it's zooming it out when we're out of this version here. You can still kind of see it here. This is what they brought me. So somebody brings me in this piece. It's like Comic Sans type. It's got some weird just sunbeams in here. There's a line to try and show what's going on. There's some mountain peaks and some trees, a lot of gradients in it. Every state that they were going to visit on the boat tour, some lines. And this is the original thing they brought me. What you're seeing in the center is me redesigning it to try and make a patch style design that I thought looked a little bit better. I was not going to make this piece. If we look over here, what can you see immediately that's going to cause trouble? What you can't see is that these two little square icons that are on this piece, those are little trail marker icons for hiking and fishing. Those were never going to run at any size. These are teeny tiny, a couple of millimeters. They're not going to run. They'd have to dominate the whole design. Are they important? I asked, and no, they're not that important. What was important was the river, the lake, the boat itself, which I redrew a kind of side view of the similar boat to what they had here. And then they wanted all these locations. So what did I do? I made a location ring, all this text in sizes that would work that went around the design. And as you can see, I made the yellow sky instead. I had some full fills in here. I had the mountain done entirely in green, added some little manual stitch trees, did some mountains that actually look like a range. None of that gradient work that's done here. And as you can see, the end result has the text in a way that's legible outside of the original design area. Arguably, if I would have made the design that they brought me versus the design that I had, and I'm not a graphic artist, I am a self taught graphic artist, if anything, which means that I can do some design work, but I'm not perfect. Someone could make a better patch than I did here. But and here's the thing, you make concessions. They used Comic Sans. I went with something that is much more like a Dom casual brush script. It's more like a classic art sign brush script that would be done for hand signage. I think it's a not a lot nicer look, but it still has the feeling that they were looking at. Something that had rounded ends and a friendly look that was a nice layout. So I've got also nice large text with big open counters in the A's and in the O's, things that look nice that turn out well for them. And honestly, I think that the overall look is better. Is this perfect? No. A better artist could do a better piece than this by far. Does this work for embroidery? Yes. Does it look better than the original clip art monstrosity that they brought me? Absolutely, it does. Would I call it a monstrosity in front of my client? No, no, I would not. So that's just one of those things that happens. Other things that we talk about frequently. Here we are again, the dreaded underlay popping out. In this case, we can see that it's all popping out to one side here. Um, in text that's this small, this was done on a cap. This was like a chambray cap. And this was popping out all up toward one corner. It was all moving out to one side. I did work on the insets a little bit and I went ahead and made this into center run. Center run really narrow, or you change your insets on your edge run all the way to the centers on your contours so that they line up in the center. And you end up with a tight doubled run. Because we have really small text here, it works well, right? It didn't have to have all that extra stability. I'm running on a garment that doesn't really have a lot of texture to it. And because I was on an unstructured hat, I was seeing that the distortion was happening up toward one corner. That means it's going to end up with, quite a lot more distortion as it moves away from the bottom center of the hat. And it's not distorting the same on both sides. It's definitely all toward one side. That way, I'm not just going to be setting my inset in. The thing is, when I often see these stitches coming out, people then tear out all the underlay stitching on everything they're using. And I'm going to say that up here, where we have some splitting because of the interaction between these rays in this sunburst and this satin stitch, and especially because they were using at this point in my career really old school metallics that didn't run very well. I was very happy to have a little bit of underlay on these sunbursts because it was covering up for small gaps that were happening in the normal running of the embroidery and in some splitting that was happening between these two angles of satin stitch. So I didn't want to tear out all the underlay entirely, but you can definitely see where it's shifting all to one direction like that. Then it might be a case for us to look at the digitizing and say, all right, even though you might say it's an execution problem, if despite the fact that I've made the changes and my hat is as stable as it can be, I still can't get it to quit shifting like this, then we correct for the shifting we see and we don't worry about necessarily the why. We correct for it the best way we can. If I can correct for it in the digitizing and everything else is running well, and as you can see, everything else here, despite being very small and there you can see a little bit more of the texture this close to a design than you might want to. Um, was all running good, looked clean from a decent distance. I'm not going to tear the rest of the design up or try and change everything about the way that this is put together or add a bunch of stabilizer to it. I'm just going to make a change for the couple of stitches that are sticking out, and I'm going to do it in digitizing. And certainly, I'm not just going to tear it all out. I'm going to look at what's happening and try and adjust for it. Uh, Otherwise, we have some things that are definitely execution. This is a piece you may have seen before. It's an earlier version of my kind of Trapunto USA. We see all of this horrible material and snagginess here. We're dealing with a tension issue, very obviously. I tell people this all the time. They have tension issues or looping issues, and they're trying to tell me it's a digitizing issue. I wish, as a digitizer, that I can control tension this tightly on each stitch. That is not necessarily the case. These days, there is more control depending on the machine you're on for altering tension on the fly. However, for something like this, where we're getting looping in one area, that is much more likely to be a problem with, let's say, I don't know, a dirty bobbin spring. Like it might have been here, where something's caught under the leaf spring, the tension spring on the bobbin. It's loosening up the thread path and it's allowing the bobbin to come up more than you want it to, and so we're getting a ton of looping and weirdness in the material. That's often how it goes. Oh, and by the way, we were talking about tacoing or dishing and cupping earlier. This is what I'm going to talk about. One of my early attempts at doing gradients ended up with this. we are looking at what's supposed to be the flat edge of this design, and it's coming up and down over the top. And honestly, that's one of those things where we've got a bunch of density that's all running at this angle. You guys may have seen me talk about this piece before. And because there's all of this density, I layered color on top of color on top of color at full density in the center of this piece. All of that extra density pushing together as those stitches try and push away from each other, perpendicular to the stitch angle. They are pushing out, they are making those wedges into the material, and we're ending up with, I guess this is convex. It's not really a taco, but if you pushed on the center of it, it would pop in and be concave. We're getting this distortion where the design doesn't look horrible from a distance, but if you look up close to it, it is absolutely bending. It is absolutely making that classic kind of inverted taco shape because we've got too much density. And in this case, that's digitizing. And people might look at this if you don't know any better and say, oh, well, we probably don't have the stabilizer we need. Trust me, it has more stabilizer than it should. This is a digitizing issue. In any case, we've got some other stuff here. Like I said, it's really more about knowing what's going on. This is the classic edge run underlay popping out outside of satin stitch. This is the one time where I do say just tear out all the edge run underlay. I don't use edge run on 3D foam because it does this so many times. Not my image, but it's the one I love to use. It was sent to me by somebody asking me for this problem. This is somebody using edge run underlay to try and trim the material before it shows up. And in the middle of this structured hat, it was moving. And it meant that all of this stitching and the foam that was trapping under it was sticking out of the edge. They couldn't get that cleanliness in that edge. Same kind of stuff. We're just looking for places it shifts and we're working on it. The thing to really take away from this ultimately is that we have to have that kind of scientific mindset. I have other episodes where I've talked about it, but it's really easy enough just to say we should understand that this is a holistic process, that the way the design is put together, the way that we use our materials, and the way that we digitize, these three things all come together to make the final piece. If we don't have control over one of the other of these, it's very easy for us to try and compensate with the one we do have control over. As digitizers, sometimes when we work for other people, we can't make them do the right thing on their machines. We'll put it that way. Stabilize the way that we want to. So sometimes we do extra compensation or add slop or make borders thicker because we're trying to make it work the best way we can. And honestly, people who are using stock designs or who are using digitizers often add stabilizer, trying to compensate for the fact that the digitizer should really be fixing something. But ultimately, when we're looking at our own designs and our own execution, what we need to think about are these things. Uh, as usual, is the design suited for what we're doing? Does it take embroidery into account? Is it designed for the medium? Is the digitizing done in such a way that it provides for the distortion that's natural to what we're doing? When we're testing it also, are we doing smart testing? Are we keeping that scientific mindset? Are we controlling our environments? Are we using the right kinds of mediums when we're testing as well? Are we using the materials that we intend to use? Is that what we're doing in our digitizing? And when we have a problem, does it happen in the same place every time? Does it make sense that the file could control it? Is it the kind of thing that digitizing could do? And in our execution, are we doing the basic things we must do to get the hoop tight, to get the stabilizer right for the intended material and the design we're running? And is our machine in operating order the way it should be? Is our hooping correct? Is everything tense and doing the right thing? So it's just what we have to kind of think about, is that holistic way things are doing. So let's go ahead and grab a final couple of comments and then we'll go ahead and be done with that. So Lisa says, LOL, then there's the graphic artist. Now Digitizer doesn't have access to a embroidery machine all the time. There are tons of people who go from graphic art and want to do embroidery, and especially want to do patches or some specific kind of embroidery that they like. And they do graphic art. They do very nice graphic art. They decide to do embroidery and think what they need is the software that puts the stitches in the shapes they already drew. It's missing a critical element. Just as it is true that as embroiderers, if we design something, we sometimes make some pretty ugly stuff because we don't really know a lot about balance or layout or the weight of a design or visual tension or the things that designers know, we might not know. But in truth, we can have the same thing the opposite way. Designers who don't know embroidery may not know the technical nature of our materials, and certainly may not test on machines. And they're looking at the file, and what is the classic thing people say that will continually make digitizers and embroiderers will cringe? What makes us all cringe every time is it looked good on screen. It looked exactly the way I wanted it on screen. I'm sorry, graphic artist, the screen is lying to you. It does not like you. It wants you to have a bad day. It's trying to trick you. If it's not in stitches, it doesn't matter. Stitches or it didn't happen. That's just how it is. And absolutely, that's how I feel about it. Sometimes there's a lot of digitizers who show you digital previews. And the thing that's been happening lately, and I won't comment too much on it, people are using digital previews of embroidery, the 3D previews that we all like to show. And I've shown one here, in fact. And they're Photoshop compositing these things onto garments and going, excellent, perfect stitch out, high quality. Check it out. Couldn't believe it turned out this good. And I'm like, I can't believe it either because that's not thread, my man. Anyway, stitches or it didn't happen. Mike says, LOL, I am a utility artist. My graphic skills extend to cut, paste, and move. Got to draw something from scratch. Unless it's a triangle, we need a real artist. Sometimes that's the case too. I mean, I do okay. I can draw some things. And especially with some reference, and I kind of have an idea, I can draw some things. I can lay out some text like a bandit sometimes. I can do real good making some text look all right. And I can do some layout work if I have to, if the assets are drawn. I can do a redraw very well. If somebody's already done a nice piece of work and it's just in a bad piece of art, I can redraw. But yeah, if you need something designed from scratch, it's not the same skill set. Sometimes we want to talk to a designer. If you have like best of both worlds, chef's kiss, you've got a designer who knows what embroidery is, that's great. Or you have a designer who will talk to you about what the elements you need are, and you can say, hey, I'm an embroidery artist. I'm going to send you a list of things to be aware of for embroidery. And this is a great thing to do. And I've actually provided people with my list, like the safe text that's 5 millimeters tall. Tell them, hey, any text you use, if you're designing this from scratch, I need it to be 5 millimeters tall on the smallest letter in order for this to stitch correctly. Please try and design within this 4-inch square that I've given you, but I need any text that you lay out to be at least 4 millimeters or 5 millimeters tall, 4 millimeters or around there if you're using 60-weight thread. And that's going to mean that anything you draw will work out. That is a fantastic thing to get with a digitizing setup. If you can have as a digitizer an artist who will work with you, or like I said, chef's kiss perfection, you get a digitizer or an artist who's digitized or an artist who's worked with embroiderers before. Fantastic. Doesn't happen a lot. And Joanne says, I think the one in the States looks fantastic. Hey, I'm glad you liked it. Hopefully they had a good trip and hopefully they liked it years and years ago. I've done a lot of design work over the years out of necessity. Here's hoping some people liked it when they had to. Ramona says, I've been asked if I can use looping as a texture element. Sorry, but I wouldn't know how to make that happen. Yeah, not on purpose. People have sold entire systems. If you look at things like, it makes me think of I believe Floriani had that Fuari system they were selling for a while, where essentially they had a cut pile. They had a material, like a water soluble material that they were stitching through, and it made big loops. And then they would cut the tops off and take out the material or whatever that foam material was that was in the middle. And they ended up with this cut pile loopy stuff going on. There was that. Certainly, we had the micro chenille, the Melco machines with the active feed technology. People were using those to make a kind of faux micro chenille. And now what we have are people, and honestly, that looks kind of interesting. It's interesting stuff that people are doing. Like we have Vitor's been doing the kind of randomized stitching over foam that looks kind of chenille like. It's interesting, but it's not loops. It's not exactly the same as looping. And honestly, that is called chenille machines, and even those are controlled in a different way. And honestly, it's a very different thing, very cool thing. I've always wanted to work with one, but I haven't had a lot of chance to mess around with chenille, even though I've helped some people out with it before. It's not something I got to do a lot of. So I'm a little jealous when it's people working on chenille machines. It is fun. Lisa says that face, we need that emoji, Eric Campbell. Yeah, we'll see about that. Maybe I'll draw up a disapproving Eric or a do you really think that's a good idea? I think that's the idea that we're going for. Last couple of things here. Mike says, there's one thing I could tell every graphic artist. It's to pick colors from a thread chart, not a Pantone book, please. I have absolutely 100% FedExed a thread guide to someone. It is worthwhile. The other thing you can do, I know it depends on what thread that you're using. Madeira certainly does have a Pantone chart, though just like I say with a lot of other things, Pantone, if you know about Pantone, they have different things for reflective or plasticky material, for glossy and for matte. You can match colors to a degree, but thread is a very unique animal, and matching colors, even from a thread chart, is difficult. But I would say if you have an artist you're working with all the time, spend the extra couple of bucks with your thread supplier, and yes, I know it can be more than that, and send them a chart marked out with the threads that you use. Or make them a palette. It's a great way to go. Make them a thread palette and send it to them. You can do that. It is worth it. And I agree with you, Lisa. I like utility artist. That is a great way to put it. Daryl says, always amazed how many clients we print for have art designed by graphic artists that have no background or no knowledge on how to create artwork for apparel. 100%. 100%, folks. I cannot tell you how many times I have looked at a brand guide, and it is like a blessing. If you look at someone's style guide from a big brand or a college or whatever you're working on, and I've done a fair amount of stuff for large brands or for colleges or for, like I said, national companies. When you do that and the brand guide says apparel in it and it has something for, and honestly, I'll even be happy when it has screen print because frequently what it'll have is color options for single color screen print, which is something that frequently happens with embroidery where we have to do things like add names to something and I don't know what colors are okay to use with their logos or what supplementary fonts that they're okay to use with their logo types. But it is so infrequent that we have that going. And I'll say this, I actually made some hay as a digitizer by providing those guidelines to companies and saying, hey, buy the file from me. I will make you up a guideline that has a thread color chart, that has an image of how it should look stitched, and I will provide you with a physical sample to keep on your books and essentially make you up the embroidery portion of your style guide. And you would be surprised how much lock in you get as the preferred vendor who already knows how the style should be if you help them to establish the style through your superior knowledge of embroidery as a medium. So, very good stuff to think about. And yeah, finding that from a client is so rare, but when it happens, it is lovely. That is the unicorn, right? That's the golden Easter egg for sure if you're hunting. And Mike says looping on purpose is chenille. Haha. Yeah, no, that's the only embroidery that's looped on purpose, my friends. It's chenille machines, and that's what does it correctly. Cindy says, I've been out with a customer. Never be sorry for that. Make that money all day long. Stack paper, make the machines move. That's what we're here to do if you're commercial. And even if you're not, make the machines move anyway. If you step away to catch your machine doing something weird, by all means, never feel bad. You can listen to me later. Daryl says added value, and that is what I am all about. Add value, add value, add value, and use that to increase what they trade with you to make that exchange better for you. Because as always, these are the limited hours of your lifespan you are spending at this craft, whether it is for the commercial purposes or it is for creativity. Make sure that it feeds you in one way or another. And when we're working on these things, when we're diagnosing problems, when we're trying to figure out whether it is our design, whether it's our digitizing, whether it's our execution that makes things the way they are, remember that sometimes we're going to have to reach out for help. If we haven't done the digitizing and we really feel like that's what's happening in our design, we may have to reach out, and it's not something we should chase down. Before you edit, before you spend a lot of time, before you test and test and test, reach out to the other people you're working with. Make sure you're communicating with people. Make sure you are communicating with your client about their expectations, and take the time to evaluate your own assumptions as well as theirs to make sure you're making choices that make sense, that are rooted in a logical scientific mindset as to what's going on. Don't just throw things at the wall. Think first, analyze, and always communicate and ask for help when you need to. All right, with that, folks, I hope you have a great rest of your Good Friday. I hope you have a fantastic weekend. And if I don't see you until then, I want to let you know next week we will not be having a normal take up. I will be off at the DEX show in Chicagoland. If you are out in the Chicagoland area, if you are in Illinois, anywhere around Tinley Park, and you want to see me teach, on Thursday, I'm teaching my beginning digitizing class. It helps you establish the foundations for digitizing. I'm not going to be hands on walking you through your first design. I'm going to give you all of the things that I wish I would have known before I started my first digitizing and my first design so that you have the foundations to know where you're headed from moment one. If you're brand new, great class to go to. The next day after that, I am teaching a much shorter class. First day is a 4-hour workshop or 3-hour workshop. Second day is a 1-hour class on editing, and I would love to have you guys in on that. Either one of those, if it is good for you, probably don't do both because the editing class covers a little bit of what happens in the digitizing class. However, you want to come down to Illinois. If you are there around the Tinley Park, Chicagoland area, go out to daxshow.com and you can find all of the information, daxshow.com. And that's where I'm going to be next week, but that's also why you won't be seeing me at this hour. I'll try to pop in and say a couple things and let you guys know what's going on. But for now, I can't wait to see you again the Friday after next.